All right. So, hey, SM rank and rent projects for rank and rent projects. Would you recommend building sites around a city or only go after niches that can go statewide or national? Well, I recommend going after an industry or a niche because then you can scale, build a brand, guys. I can't stress that enough. And I've been talking about that for years, actually. Build a brand. Google recognizes brand. So if you're building a city specific site, yeah, you can build a brand out of that, but it's pretty much pigeonholed to that. Well, that's not true. You could start with a brand in a particular city and then expand. In any case, build a branded site is what I'm saying. Build a brand because that's what matters. If you build authority to a brand / entity, right? A brand is an entity. Then you can build a lot of authority to it, and over time it becomes easier when you add subsequent locations to rank. I've been talking about that for years, which is again going back to the G site discussion we just had a moment ago. Instead of building multiple different G sites, why not build one and power and build silo structure into it for multi-location businesses? You can add a top level page for each city, right? And that starts a silo, and then you add sub pages into that silo, all of that. Because now, again, over time, as you build more topical authority through the site structure and the content of the site itself, but also build authority through external backlinks to the site, you're going to power that asset up so that as you add additional or expand and you add additional locations, they instantly benefit from the authority of the domain or the site, whatever. Does that make sense? So it's easier to scale over time when you have built authority to a particular brand in one site, right? So that's why I always prefer to do it that way, because over time, like I said, the first 5 or 6 locations that you publish, you're probably going to have to. It's like starting from scratch with every one. But once you get to a certain level of like recognition by Google, like that you built enough authority to the local entity that it makes it easier when you publish a new location. All of a sudden, you'll notice that as you publish new locations, they tend to rank quicker. Sometimes in low competition areas, you'll rank instantly. As soon as it gets indexed, you'll rank because you've built authority to the brand, the domain, etc. Does that make sense? So I would prefer to go, and again, this is what I teach guys. The program that I keep referencing is called Directory Hybrid Agency. I hope to launch that in October. My goal is to release the training into our mastermind. There will be a separate, as of our live event, POFU Live, which is at the end of September. And then the goal after that is to launch it as an actual course. But it's a whole business in a box. And that's about building a directory and choosing an industry, building a directory, and then building a local component, which is what I call the directory local site, which is building lead gen assets that can be used for rank and rent, pay per lead, or even just for prospecting purposes. But again, it's always on it's one brand that you go nationally with, if that makes sense, because it's, in my opinion, it's better that way. So, sorry. I prefer to do niche industry specific stuff. And you can always, by the way, you can pick an industry. So decide on a brand name, right? Something that's memorable, that's not generic, because it's easier to establish it as an entity if it's a brandable name, a unique name, right? So come up with something that can be a brandable name and build a site around it. You can start with just one location, one city, whatever. You can always expand later. But if you're going to do that, just keep in mind when you're planning out the project, you got to think about silo structure, like the architecture of the site. Like, how are you going to build the structure of the site? Because if you're going to expand nationally over time, that changes the way that I would build a site. So I would use what's called a complex silo structure versus simple silo, which means you have basically 3 different levels in the URL structure. You got root, then you have top level page, top level category, child page, subcategory, which is step 2. And then step 3 would be posts. And so again, it changes the way that I would build sites. If it's going to be a local or regional project, it's generally going to be a simple silo. If it's going to be a multi-state project, it's going to be a complex silo. And again, that's just the way that I structure the build. So just plan that out ahead of time. But like I said, if you just plan on building a national site around a particular brand, then it gives you a lot of options to expand later without having to start over from scratch. That's the point that I'm trying to make.